Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at some basic e-bike geometry and how that's critical whether you're on or off the bike, and how it impacts whether you're actually setting your bike up or indeed riding it out on the trails. Now first up, I want to point out that there's geometry which is fixed and there's geometry which is adjustable. You could, I suppose, compare it to the size of your bike, which is fixed, you can't move on that, or the fit of your bike, which is adjustable. For example, this distance here between the head tube and the top of the seat tube. Now, as you can see, the frame dimension, that is fixed, you can't change that. However, the fit of the bike can be affected by you moving your seat forwards and backwards, or indeed put in a longer or shorter stem up front. Now the first geometry measurement I'm going to discuss is reach. Now this is measured from the center of the head tube for a line that goes across and intersects with a line which comes vertically up from the bottom bracket. So basically it's that measurement there. And all these measurements can be found on each manufacturer's website. Okay, so why is reach so important? Well, it's actually quite a good indicator of size, and it's usually quite consistent amongst brands. However, there are some manufacturers who do tend to measure differently on occasions. Now, when it comes to numbers, my reach measurement is usually about 485 and I'm 6 foot tall. So for example, if you're 5'10", then I think you need to be looking at a number about 20 millimeters less, whereas if you're over 6 foot, maybe a reach measurement of 20 millimeters more. Now, what I want to point out is that if, for example, you're in a bike shop and you've got a sales guy who's trying to sell you a bike with a reach measurement of 440 millimeters and you're 6 foot tall, then maybe the alarm bells should start ringing. Now, reach really does have an impact when you're out on the trail, because if you have a bike that is too small for you with a small reach, then you're constantly be thrown forwards or rearwards on the bike, trying to overcompensate for that bike which is too small for you. And what that leads to is a lot of fatigue as you're moving forwards and rearwards on the bike. Remember that reach in itself cannot be viewed in isolation, because it too is impacted by such things as the bottom bracket height, which is going to push your weight up in the air, or a stem, which is going to push you too far forwards or too far back. But reach, when it comes to a balanced ride, it really is quite critical. The top tube is a frequently quoted dimension on every mountain bike, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, it is fixed on every bike. However, I think on an e-bike a more important dimension is actually the bar to the seat, because that's going to affect your climbing ability and your comfort on your e-bike. Now, the bar to seat measurement is affected by many things. First of all, the seat tube angle. Secondly, where the seat is in its rails, the length of your stem, and the shape and height of your handlebars. Now remember, on an e-bike, it's really important to be able to get that traction onto that rear tire, which means you're going to be shifting around on in the cockpit area of your bike a lot more than you will be on a non-e-bike. Chainstay is a dimension which is fixed on most mountain bikes, although there are some on the market where you can adjust that on the rear axle, and the dimension is actually measured from the center of the bottom bracket to the center of the rear axle. So why is it important? Well, it affects climbing quite considerably, because longer chainstays, say from around 470 to 480 millimeters, put more of a bias on the front of the bike, whereas shorter chainstays create a more snappier ride. That bike really does heel into the corner much more quickly. That's not to say you can't learn to corner quickly on a bike with longer chainstays. It's just about adaptation. Now, what you really need to be aware of is if you do have a bike with super short chainstays, then that's going to bias your weight quite a lot rearwards. So you need to counter that by leaning slightly further forwards or moving your body onto the front of the seat more when you're tackling those hill climbs. Now, as you can see, there's a huge difference in each brand's philosophy when it comes to chainstay length. Have a look at that 426 millimeter dimension on the Rocky Mountain compared to the 490 millimeters on the Mondraker level. These are huge differences, and they will affect handling both uphill and downhill on the bike. Now, as with any other dimension on your mountain bike, don't forget that a chainstay alone cannot be measured in isolation, because if you have a long chainstay, then that needs to be balanced out with a long front center. Now, the front center is the measurement from the bottom bracket to the front axle on the bike. So if you've got, as I say, a long chainstay on the bike, you need to have a long front center to balance that bike out so your body's in that sweet spot. Bottom brackets, do you know what? It's my favorite dimension on any mountain bike. Now that is measured from the center of the bottom bracket to the ground. Although a lot of manufacturers actually measure it, if you have a line drawn from the front axle to the rear axle, it's actually how much lower the bottom bracket is off that line. Now most of the time it's a negative measurement, which means it's underneath that line from axle to axle. Why is it important? Because it really does affect the handling of the bike, particularly in corners. It's also affected by such things as the style of bike, the wheel size, and the amount of travel on the bike. Now, what about the numbers? Well, if I'm riding a bike which is 150 to 170 mil travel, I'm looking at about 340 to 350 millimeters on the bottom bracket, because that keeps my center of gravity low, and when it comes to cornering, it really gets into those corners so much more easier than a bike with a higher bottom bracket, which actually tends to stand the bike up and not corner quite as easily. Bottom bracket is both affected by and affects many things. Remember, these are static numbers. The numbers when you are sat on the bike will be affected by the sag of the bike and the suspension design, which will affect the bike when you are riding it. For example, soft suspension will lower that bottom bracket, while hard suspension will keep it in a high ride height. And don't forget, progressive suspension and linear style suspension designs will affect that bottom bracket height too. The head angle really is a measurement which has settled down in the last 10 years. If you've got a bike which is about 150 to 170 mil travel, it tends to be around about 64 to 66 degrees. And what that does is provide a really stable bike when you're descending, because if you've got a head angle in the 68, 69 degree ballpark, then that does tend to skew the weight slightly further forward. It also provides a more twitchy ride to the bike, whereas a bike with a 64 to 65 head angle is far more settled on those descents. When it comes to the adjustment, you can actually adjust the head angle on some bikes by way of an angle set in the head tube. Remember, on other bikes such as this, the Canyon Spectralon, the head angle measurement is going to be changed if you change the geometry of the bike, because there's like a little chip there which lowers the bottom bracket, so that is going to slacken out that head angle. Wheelbase is the measurement from the rear axle to the front axle. But remember, it's all about the proportions, between the chainstay length and the front center length. Because what we're trying to do is get that sweet spot in the middle of the bike where you don't have to overcompensate both forwards or rearwards. Now, long wheelbase bikes are amazing on descents. They really do provide a really stable ride. However, when it comes to flatter terrain where you're trying to pick the bike up and move it around, they can sometimes be a little bit boring. In terms of wheelbase numbers, they are massively different from brand to brand, and as I mentioned, it's affected by such things as the chainstay, the front center, and the head tube angle. So I won't really give you a sweet spot, because it really depends on the style of riding you do. For example, some people who ride 170 mil travel bikes tend to do more downhill orientated riding, whereas others do more enduro style riding. So it really is up to you to work out the sweet spot of wheelbase on your bike. Those then are my critical geometry figures which you need to be aware of, both when you're in the workshop or when you're out and about on the trail. I suppose I could have thrown in the C-tube angle on the bike, but that does seem to have settled down in recent years between 74 and 75 degrees, and that gives a good balance position where you can climb or descend really effectively. Remember, of course, it all depends where that seat is up or down. Actually, do you know what? If you want to look at a video which is more dynamic in terms of the use of geometry, check out the video which myself and Chris did on seat up or seat down. Hope you like this video. Let us know your comments on geometry, on any questions you might have on geometry in the comments below. And that's about it. Don't forget to click on the globe in the middle to subscribe to EMBN and give us a thumbs up.